Hello, friends, welcome back to Sorry What. Grab your pitchforks and let's begin today's story. Pathetique. Jim could hear his mother-in-law, Sofie, snarl the word as he moved down the hallway past the living room. He didn't pause to find out what had sparked her disapproval. He already knew. It was him. He'd overheard several conversations between his new wife and his mother-in-law since her arrival from France. Not only was it clear that she disapproved of her daughter's marriage, but it was clear that she felt that Monique had shortchanged herself and life experiences. You need a man who will take control of you, Monique, not some milquetoast American who gives you whatever you want. You don't know the wonder of having an O forced out of you. Well, your man takes control of you and makes you his salop. Once you give yourself fully to his control, it's l'amati, the wonder. It's the way nature meant it to be. You give yourself to him and your whole body responds to him. Jim almost laughed when he overheard my mother-in-law haranguing his wife with her theories of human relations. But, Mayman, Jim gives me many os, and he's wonderful. He's kind and understanding, and his wife tried to respond. Then he should understand that you need a man who will take you, who will possess you, not kiss your jolly cull every time you bend over. Her mother sounded almost indignant at the thought of a man worshipping his beloved. Jim had met Monique in Vietnam on his second tour as a 96E, an interrogator. His Quebecois mother had taught him French, and the army had spent a year in Monterey, California, trying to teach him Vietnamese. Jim didn't feel confident in the Asian language, but he had proven himself an ace interrogator in English and French. Monique had worked in the French embassy in Saigon, and she and Jim had been introduced by a mutual friend. By the end of his tour, they were set to wed. It wasn't until they returned stateside and were settling into their quarters at Fort Holabird, MD, that he found out that her mother in France had expressed disapproval of their marriage when she was notified, after the fact. Jim offered to pay for his mother-in-law's travel expenses to come visit her daughter, sure that once she saw how happy her daughter was, she'd rethink her disapproval. He didn't understand when that didn't happen. If anything, it cemented her disapproval and disappointment in her daughter. Jim, Mayman is very much a Samise, someone who needs to be dominated. I used to worry very much about her, because men use and abuse her, and then cast her aside. My father, whoever he was, put her in the hospital when he found out she was pregnant, and left her there. She still weeps for him. She tells me he was the strongest man she ever knew, and still feels she belongs to him. Monique shook her head at her mother's fetish. Jim laughed. She's nuts. He didn't worry as her mother spent her time trying to convert her daughter to her way of thinking. Jim figured if Mayman hadn't succeeded by now, everything was going to be fine. Then Jim was informed that his particular talent was required again in Saigon, and he agreed to another 6-month tour, even though it meant extending his enlistment by a full month. He planned to take his discharge now that he was married, feeling he would be able to better support his wife and eventual children as a civilian. Monique's mother volunteered to remain in the States with her daughter while he was gone, and since that seemed to make his wife happy, he agreed. Besides, Sofie had found someone to dominate her on post, a Sergeant Major Jason Stroud, out of the battalion S2. He seemed like a real custard to Jim, and although he didn't like the way Stroud ogled his wife, her mother seemed to be able to control him. He did worry about the bruises that were evident on Sofie's arms and every other area of displayed flesh. Jim was concerned that he might have to step in, something that won attempts at their peril with Sergeant Majors. No, Monique tutted at him when he asked. Mayman is very happy. This is what she loves. I don't know. I've never understood it no matter how much she tries to explain. You go, do your duty. Don't worry about Mamie and me. We'll be fine. So, Jim went to Saigon and did his tour. He and Monique corresponded, and she always assured him that things were fine, that she loved him and couldn't wait for him to return. I miss your loving, she would close each letter. Jim had entered the service in Oakland, California, and returning from Vietnam, he was shipped to Oakland for out processing. Once done, he headed home to Holabird, ready to move his wife and her mother out of the base housing. At the airport, Monique ran to him, jumping into his arms and wrapping her legs around his waist. Their kiss was passionate and seemed to go on forever. Finally, they moved on to baggage to retrieve Jim's duffel and grip. When Monique bent over to pick up his grip, her sleeve moved upwards on her arm, and Jim saw 3 round bruises on her arm. She had been gripped and gripped hard enough to bruise. Jim grabbed her arm and pushed the sleeve all the way up to see the bruises. They were the only ones he saw. Monique stared back at him, then reached up and pushed her sleeve back down. Don't worry, Jim, everything is fine. When he went to question her, she shook her head and said, we'll talk at home. It was a quiet ride home. Scenarios ran through Jim's head, foremost being the expectation that Mayman's Sergeant Major had grabbed his wife. Anger festered in Jim's brain. By the time they were home, he was ready to kill that custard Stroud. Inside the house, Jim instantly dropped his duffel and spun his wife around to face him. Okay, now tell me. Jim, I love you. It's okay. Let's sit down. Monique pulled him over to the couch and sat, then waited for Jim to join her. Jim, I love you. I love the way you make love, but she paused, with a look of guilt that froze Jim's heart. But Mayman was right. There's something about being taken. Jim jumped up. Did that custard your mother submits to touch you? He yelled. No, no. Mamie would never allow that. Monique nervously smiled. But he has friends. The plural pierced his heart. He picked up his duffel and his grip and staggered out to his car. Monique pursued him, swearing she still loved him, and that Mayman assured her that this wouldn't affect their marriage. Jim controlled himself by squeezing the keys in his hand until they cut into his flesh. He wanted to send his wife, her lovers, and her goddamned mother to the afterlife. He raised his hand swiftly but stopped its downward movement as his wife cringed. He got into the car and quickly drove away. Monique had ignored her mother's urgings to go out and have fun for the first 4 months of Jim's tour, but finally gave in one night. She was bored. She didn't really like any of the other army wives, and without children or a job, had nothing to occupy her time. What harm could a night out cause? It turned out, plenty. Mayman's lover brought a friend to escort her, was the excuse, and he became her dance partner. It did feel good to have a man hold her. She really missed her Jim. As the drinks flowed freely, Monique let her hair down, with her mother encouraging her. Her dance partner's hands roamed wildly over her body, and again, it felt good. When he suggested that they go outside to cool off, she agreed. When he kissed her, it didn't seem like much. When he pushed aside her bra and caressed her nip-nips, they sprang out and sent shock waves through her body. What happened next was fuzzy, but suddenly her sergeant was ripping off her panties, and she was pushed over the fender of a parked car. As he entered her, her first thought was that she was being raped, but then she wondered she had been making out with him, enjoying his caresses had she said no at all. Had she, somehow, agreed. Then her body began responding. Jim never abused her like this. No one ever had. He was slamming into her, hitting her cervix over and over again, slapping her on the peach, pulling her hair. When he slammed into her and held it as he finished into her womb, her O hit, and hit big. She was not a vocal person during sex, or rather, she never had been. Now she held. She pushed back and held as aftershock sent her reeling. As she came down from her high and felt something leaking out of her, her lover zipped up his pants and slapped her on her exposed peach again. Come on, babe, let's get back in. She felt guilty, and tried to object when both sergeants accompanied her mother and her into the house when they went home. Her mother laughed as she was dragged back to the bedroom. Her mother laughed even more in the morning, recalling to her daughter's embarrassment the howling she had heard throughout the night. After that, she found the joy her mother found in submitting. She loved Jim, but her body responded to dominance. It excited her to be treated like a whore. Over the next 2 months, Stroud and Mayman brought over different men, all of whom dominated the young wife. Sometimes there was one, sometimes more than one. Her mother's sergeant never had her sexually, but Stroud would have Mamie tie her down wearing nothing, and then he would whip her. It hurt, but somehow it impassioned her. She would lie, desperate for release after they had finished whipping her, still tied down as the two lovers frantically coupled. Watching them added to her desperation, and when they would bring in the men, she would again and again, until they released her. Then she would submit to whomever they brought in. She knew she wasn't thinking right. She knew she loved Jim, but even his sweet lovemaking couldn't coax sauce like these from her, certainly not the rolling series of them she experienced after a good whipping. She allowed Mayman to convince her that Jim would understand, that her milquetoast husband would want her to be happy. Everything would be fine once she explained it to Jim. Now Jim was back from Vietnam, but when she tried to explain, he was gone. Jim had his mustering out pay and had a destination in mind. He had no family, he was an only child, and his parents had passed away during his first tour. He had inherited their home in the Oakland Hills, and had rented it out to a childhood friend and her family. He called ahead from St. Louis, and Felice assured him that the guest room was always open to him. He couldn't figure out what to do. His wife admitted cheating on him, but he had no proof, so could he divorce on the grounds of adultery? He didn't think so. On the other hand, they didn't have any assets, other than his parents' house, which he had had before their marriage, so there was no pressing need for any legal action. Monique and Sofie could go to hell. Let them figure it out. He settled into the guest room and soon seemed like part of the family. He was willing to babysit Felice and Mark's 2 girls, who at 6 and 4, loved climbing all over their Uncle Jim. He used the GI Bill to re-enter college. He had 2 years in before the service, and California's state college system was cheap enough that the GI Bill payments were enough for him to live off, with rent from Felice added to it, although he discounted the rent, since they were putting him up. He'd always wanted to study engineering, and he finally had the chance. He didn't date, although Mark and Felice kept encouraging him, up to and including inviting beautiful women over to dinner. He would explain that he was still married, and it wouldn't be right. When Felice asked about divorce, he explained not having any proof of adultery, and at this point didn't really care enough to pursue it. He hoped that eventually Monique would file for abandonment. In the meantime, he didn't want her to know where he was. Felice shook her head. "You're not in Maryland anymore. You're in California. Reagan signed the Family Act law in 1969. You can divorce here based on irreconcilable differences, which could be anything, and doesn't require any proof." Using his army contacts in Maryland, he was able to track down Sofie, who was still living with her domineering Sergeant Major. From there, it was easy to find Monique, who was shacked up with another fellow sergeant. He had her served with divorce papers there. Monique cried when she got the divorce papers. She had hoped that someday, Jim would realize that he loved her and come back to rescue her. She wanted to fight the divorce, but her master, Marty, put a stop to that. "You be mine, witch. Let the clock divorce you." The excitement of being dominated and treated like a whore had dissipated after Jim had left. She'd been pounded into the mattress by another lover to whom Stroud had gifted her, when she realized that he hadn't even spoken to her, didn't care about her feelings, and had not even tried to get her moist before taking her. She realized she wasn't being dominated, wasn't being treated like a whore, she was a whore. Someone who now spread her legs for anyone who cared to make her. She had determined then and there that she would change, she would work to get back with Jim, whatever it took. How could she have been so stupid as to give him up? She laid on the bed and cried, weeping for what had been and what should have been. She could still feel Jim, still feel what the world had been like with him. There should be a way to reach back before all the stupidity and reset, some way to get back to Jim. But then Marty showed up. She had dated him a couple of times. He was more forceful and more physically endowed than her other lovers. When she tried to explain to him that she wasn't available anymore, he grabbed her by the hair and slapped her silly. She thought that was just an expression. Turned out it wasn't. Marty forced her to move in with him. He was now her dominant, her master, as he insisted she refer to him as. She was his, she even had a tattoo on her pubis attesting to that. He was clear that he didn't love her. He owned her. She was his to use however he wanted, his to share however he wanted, his to abuse in any way he wanted. She dreamed Jim would save her, until she received the papers. Now, she was destroyed. When Jim graduated from California State College in San Francisco, his best graduation present was his final divorce decree. He decided that before settling down, he'd backpack through Europe. He understood that the Eurail pass was inexpensive, and that by staying in hostels, he could see Europe on the cheap. He packed up the minimum he needed, kissed his adopted family goodbye, and flew out of San Francisco International. 2 months later, he was in Amsterdam, almost out of money and ready to return to the States. Europe had been an adventure, and the hostels had been filled with girls from the US and other countries who were on their own adventures and were willing bedmates. His new bachelorhood was well and truly started, and he was emotionally ready to pick up his life again. He bought his return ticket, leaving the following day. He'd been out shopping with the last money he had, saving just enough for last night in the hostel and a bus ride to the airport in the morning. What he had left he had spent on presents for Felice and the girls. Toy windmills, Miffy dolls and cheese balls were about all he could afford, but he knew that the girls would be happy with them. He juggled the bags as he strolled by the canal. Suddenly, he heard a scream. Across the water a little girl had pushed her toy scooter too close to the edge of the canal and had overbalanced, tumbling down the stone embankment into the water. Without a thought, Jim dropped his bags and shrugged off his jacket as he ran across the bridge to get closer to the girl before leaping off the bridge into the water. The bridge was higher and the water less deep than Jim had anticipated, and he plunged through the water into the mud on the bottom. His legs sank and the mud clung to him as he struggled to free himself and get to the girl. He finally broke the suction and began rising, leaving one shoe in the mud. As he reached the surface, he found himself next to the girl, who was face down in the water. As he turned her over, he saw that she had hit her head on the stone wall and was bleeding. He pulled her to a landing, where an old man was calling out in panic. Hands reached down and took the girl from him. Before he got out, he saw the scooter slowly sinking, and swam over to retrieve it. Hands reached down to help him out. A chauffeur was carrying the girl up the stone steps, with the old man limping up the stairs behind them. As Jim watched, they piled into a limousine and drove off. Jim smiled and left the scooter with the people on the landing, and went to retrieve his packages and jacket. They were gone. Gone with his plane ticket, wallet, money, and passport. He leaned against the bridge railing and wondered how he was going to get home. The only thing he could think of was going to the US Embassy and seeing if they could help. But he didn't remember if the embassy was in Amsterdam or The Hague. Was there a consulate? Maybe. He decided to head back to the hostel to pick up his backpack and see if he could at least shower there. As he limped along, he realized that among his other problems he needed a shoe. How do you get a shoe with no money? Now he wished he'd gotten one of those new credit cards, the Bank America card or the MasterCharge, but he'd never felt the need before. He hated the idea of going into debt, of buying things he hadn't yet paid for. But then he laughed. Even if he had gotten one of those cards, it would have been in his wallet, in his jacket, and would have been stolen with his cash. As he limped and dripped along the sidewalk, he became aware of a car pulling up next to him. It stopped and a man in chauffeur livery stepped out. He addressed Jim in Dutch, and Jim shook his head. English or Francais, he responded. Excusez-moi, monsieur, are you the gentleman from the canal? The chauffeur used both languages in his response. Jim laughed. How did you find me? He laughed back. They told me to look for someone with one shoe, dripping wet. Well, that's me. Jim was reluctant to get into the limousine, not because he had no idea who belonged to, but more because he was still dripping filthy, stinking canal water. He really just wanted to get back to the hostel and shower before he ended up with pink eye or some other infection from the polluted water. But Aldert, the chauffeur, insisted. He would drive Jim to the hostel to pick up the backpack, and then to his employer's house for a shower and dinner. Since the fact that Jim had failed to include dinner in his budget had been made moot by the theft of his money, Jim agreed to the plan. When Aldert pulled up into the sweeping driveway, Jim realized that this wasn't a house, it was a palace. It was a single, large, detached residence, complete with surrounding gardens. Jim hadn't thought such luxury existed in Amsterdam. On the steps of the main entrance stood the old man who had been with the little girl. As Jim exited the car, the old man approached and gathered him into a hug, despite Jim's reluctance. Apparently, the Dutch weren't bothered by stinking canal water. The man started out in Dutch, when Aldert gently coughed and said, American. Then with ease, the old man switched to English. My dear boy, how can I ever thank you? You saved Annelies, my granddaughter. You were so quick, so brave, so magnificent. Jim was embarrassed at the fuss the old man was making. I didn't do anything, sir. I just was there and jumped in, that was all, Mr. Van Oygen, Lars Van Oygen. He introduced himself with a handshake. I'm Jim Meadows. How's little, did you say, Annelies? Yes, Annelies. She is fine, a bad bump on her head, but thanks to you, nothing more. He linked his arm with Jim's and led him towards the house. But let's get you into a shower and into some clean clothes. Later, dressed in his only alternate clothing sans footwear, since he didn't have another pair of shoes, and he thought putting on the one remaining soggy shoe would be worse than just wearing his socks, he felt distinctly underdressed in the formal dining room, wearing his worn jeans and a white t-shirt, as dinner was served by a pair of, footmen. Jim felt like he had stepped back to the Regency period, although the waiters were dressed in simple black pants, white shirts and what he thought of a black-eyed jacket. The food was the finest he'd ever tasted, prepared by Lars' chef. Lars was commiserating with the losses Jim had suffered at the canal. Aldert tells me that you were robbed at the canal. You must allow me to make up for your losses. Well, it wasn't much. The most important loss was my passport and my airline ticket for tomorrow. I guess I need to go to the embassy tomorrow. Other than that, I lost a little cash that was in my jacket and the gifts I purchased for friends. It's nothing for you to worry about, sir. Jim paused. Maybe Aldert could drive me to the embassy tomorrow. Is it here or at The Hague? Your embassy is in The Hague, but we have a consulate here in Amsterdam. I'm sure that they can help you. I'll call and get an appointment for you in the morning. Lars responded confidently. A woman dressed in severe brown clothing came into the room, holding the hand of the young girl, Annelies. The girl smiled as she saw her grandfather and pulled away from the woman to run and jump into his lap. Grandpapa, she yelled. With a big smile on his face, the grandfather hugged the little girl, and then, propping her on his knee, he introduced her to Jim, telling her how he was the brave man who had jumped into the canal to rescue her. Again, Jim was embarrassed by the praise, but the little girl jumped off her grandfather's knee and ran to Jim, to give him a big hug. Then, looking intently at him, she in a very adult voice said, "Thank you, sir." Jim laughed, and said, "You are very welcome, miss. You sound like an American." Indignantly, she replied, "I am an American. I live in Delaware." Suddenly, there was the sound of a door slamming, and someone yelling for Annelies. The girl's face lit up as she squealed, "Mama," and ran out of the room. There followed the sound of a purse being dropped and loud kisses being applied. Soon, Annelies returned, holding the hand of a young woman, either in her late 20s or early 30s. Lars had risen and went to embrace his daughter. When the greetings were done, Lars led the woman over to Jim, who had also risen to stand by his chair. "And this is Jim Meadows, to whom we owe gratitude for saving our Annelies." Jim, this is my daughter and Annalise's mother, Mila Borden. Mila reached out to grasp Jim's hand and began to thank him profusely, while Jim again insisted that he really hadn't done much. Finally, they sat back down at the table, where Mila and Annalise were now served their suppers. Jim must go to the consulate tomorrow to replace his passport, although I think we must first take him to Pakin tomorrow and get him some new shoes. He lost one in the canal. He can't go round with just one shoe, now, can he? Lars teased. Mila laughed. I wondered at the stocking feet. Even for an American, that seems too casual. Jim blushed at the teasing. Pakin. Is it a shoe store? Well, they make all our shoes. They'll have a pair for you, before we go to the consulate. I have a pair of slippers you can wear in the meantime. Lars added. Jim also lost his airline ticket home. Someone stole his things while he was in the canal. The airline ticket is no problem. He can fly back with me and Annalise on the corporate jet. It's the very least we can do for our hero, isn't it, Annalise? She asked her daughter, who nodded enthusiastically. Do you mind putting off your return for a week, Jim? I would like to spend some time with my father before returning. Sure, I have nothing waiting for me right now. But I need to get to California, not Delaware. But I'm sure I can find my way home from there, he admitted. Lars interjected, I'm sure we can get you home. In the meantime, you'll stay with us, as our guest. As Jim started to object, he continued, and that's final. No argument. The next day, Jim was custom fitted for shoes at Pakin, but provided with a pair in his size to take care of his immediate need. He was amazed at the fit. They were the finest shoes he'd ever had. As he was leaving, the clerk assured him that his other shoes would be ready in 3 days. When he protested to Lars that it was too much, Lars just told him, nonsense, my boy. Jim was surprised at the consulate when Lars was received by the consul general. He was taken in hand by an attaché, and his replacement passport was summarily ordered, with a new photograph taken by the consulate photographer. The consul general assured Lars that the passport would be ready and delivered to his house the following day. On the way home, Lars stopped at several shops, buying expensive gifts for Felice and the girls to replace those that had been stolen. When Jim realized the cost of the gifts, he protested, but Lars insisted. A necklace for Felice and bracelets for the girls. Toys that filled the large trunk of the limousine. Even Mark was remembered, with a Patek Philippe watch. Jim objected again. He thought that Felice and Mark could buy several houses in Oakland for the cost of these presents. Nothing, he said, would dissuade his host. For the friends of my granddaughter's hero, nothing is too much. Jim finally got through to Lars when he threatened to walk away if Lars didn't dial it back. Lars was visibly shaken by the threat. Please don't do that. Mila and Annalise would be hurt if you abandoned them. His eyebrows rose. And they would blame me. Jim smiled at the old man's discombobulation. Lars, please, no more of the hero stuff. And no rewards. Helping me get the passport, putting me up at your home, and helping me get back home is more than enough. Please return all these gifts. They are unnecessary. Lars agreed, but he didn't understand this American. He saved the most precious thing in Lars' life, Annalise, but rejected the credit. While he agreed to return the extravagant gifts, he secretly planned to have them sent to Mark and Felice at the address on Jim's passport. Jim learned that Lars owned LVO Holdings, which was a family business, but was rated as the 12th largest Dutch company. Mila had married an American, John Borden, Annalise's father, and ran the American operations of LVO out of Delaware. While she had returned home out of concern for her daughter, she now had to attend to business matters at the headquarters while she was in the country. But that left her plenty of time to spend the rest of the week showing of her country to Jim, taking him, along with Annalise, around Amsterdam, The Hague, down to the beaches of Zeeland, and to Gouda, Edam and Limburg, until Annalise begged not to see any more cheeses being made. Mila laughed, and pointed out that cheese was important to their dairy-rich country. Jim found Mila surprisingly easy to be with, especially given her wealthy upbringing, and her position of corporate power. He asked Lars about her position with the company, and Lars proudly touted his daughter's strengths and business savvy. Jim was impressed. The last night in Holland, Lars and Mila sat Jim down and asked what his future plans were. He told them honestly that they were up in the air. He just graduated from college, but with 8 years in the army and 4 of college, he was a 30-year-old with no real engineering experience. He didn't expect to find employers beating a path to his door, but his plan was to search for a job once he returned to California. Of course, Lars and Mila offered to hire Jim. They owned factories in Delaware where they could use a trustworthy engineer. Jim considered it. They were good people, and from what he understood of their corporate philosophy, that goodness extended to their employees. He was about to accept, when Mila added, the salary would be $150,000 per annum, plus benefits. Jim was stunned. A good salary for an engineer would probably be less than $70,000. Damn, he thought. Just another hero bribe. They don't really want me. They just feel the need to reward me. Jim stood up. I'm tired, and it will be a long day tomorrow. I'm going to head on up to bed. He looked at Lars and Mila and shook his head. No. Thank you for the job offer, but no. I think I need to seek out my own employment. With that, he turned and left. Lars and Mila looked at each other in astonishment. They'd attempted to make the job offer as attractive as possible. They never imagined that Jim would refuse such an offer. Lars shook his head. Why would he turn it down? Didn't we offer enough? He's a good man, I really hoped he'd join us. Mila sighed. No, Papa, I think we offer too much. Jim is someone who wants to be valued for who he is. He doesn't want to be bought, and he feels we are too generous with our thanks and appreciation of Annelise's rescue. She sighed. I like this man. He reminds me of John. Lars had liked his son-in-law. Only moderately wealthy in his own right, he still refused to accept any help or financial income from his in-laws. He had prided himself on giving his wife and child everything they needed. As far as John had been concerned, Mila's money was hers to do what she wished, but it was his job to provide for what was necessary in life. Both Mila and Lars had thought he was being ridiculous, but Lars especially grudgingly respected his independent son-in-law. When he had gotten esophageal cancer, Lars had spent a small fortune trying to get John the best treatment available, but to no avail. He had passed 2 years before. Lars, Mila, and Annelise still grieved for him. Meanwhile, Sofie looked with shock at her daughter. Her sergeant had been transferred to Fort Huachuca in Arizona, when the United States Army Intelligence School, USAID, was relocated there. Sofie hadn't been back to see her daughter in over a year. Now she was shocked. What have you done? Monique stood with tears in her eyes. Her neck now sported a tattoo of a slave collar, and spades now marked both ankles and her left shoulder. Her right breast was marked with Marty's name, and Sofie could see that her braless daughter's nips sported large rings. How could you do this to yourself? Monique glared at her mother through the tears. You, Naaman, told me to give myself to a dominant man, that was the only way I would be truly fulfilled. You had me give up a loving man for someone who beats me and pimps me out. I told you to be dominated, not enslaved, you stupid girl. Sofie responded, indignantly. How dare her daughter try to blame her for messing up her life? She had been an example for the girl her whole life, but she couldn't see the difference in their situations. Bah, she spat. When I resist Marty, he hits me. I have bruises and scars from his whoopings. I've had broken ribs where he's kicked me, and he's purposely broken my fingers twice. I hate him. But I have no money, nowhere to go, nothing. Nothing. Monique pulled at her hair and moaned in frustration. You will come with me. Stroud is being transferred to Fort Meade to join the United States Army Intelligence and Security Command. If Marty objects, I'll have Stroud report him to the Army and get him kicked out. She called Stroud and had him come to help move her daughter. Back in the Netherlands, Jim was impressed with the corporate Learjet that was taking him, Mila, and Annelise back to the States. The crew of 3 included a pilot, co-pilot and steward, and there were 3 separate sleeping quarters along with the main cabin, which included captain chairs, a couch and a fully stocked bar. The very lap of luxury. They took off after 6 p.m., having received a tearful farewell from Lars, before Albert drove them to the private hangar. They had dinner on the plane, and planned to retire thereafter, sleeping through the flight. Annelise insisted on sitting on Jim's lap after dinner, in a ploy to put off going to bed as long as possible. After she started nodding off, Jim carefully carried her into her assigned room, and left Mila to put her to bed. When Mila returned, she offered Jim a nightcap, which he gladly accepted. He'd come to appreciate Lars' taste in whiskeys. As she handed him the glass, she apologized to Jim. I'm sorry about the job offer. It was clumsy of us, but we really wanted you to join us. You impressed my papa, and believe it or not, that old man is not easily impressed. I appreciate that. I liked him a lot too. He and his family are all very spectacular. Jim smiled at Mila, clearly admiring her. But you are all so overwhelming, so beyond me I'd get lost in your world. With that, he drained his glass, put it down, and reached for Mila's hand. Without a conscious thought, he brought the hand to his lips, and kissed it. Then he smiled again and went to his bunk. It took a minute for Mila to realize she had been holding her breath, suddenly inhaling sharply. There was something about Jim. It was an hour later, when Jim was awakened by a hand pushing his hair off his forehead, and lips softly touching his. He opened his eyes to see a pensive Mila regarding him, dressed in a black negligee. I couldn't let you go without telling you that you've touched my heart. What? Jim rubbed his face, trying to wake enough to understand this woman. Iku van Ju, she whispered as she leaned forward and kissed him again. That woke Jim. Shocked, he jumped back against the bulkhead. He didn't know what she'd said, but it sounded too intimate to be innocent, especially in that black negligee. "You're married. What about your husband?" She knew about his wife. He had told her. How could she think he'd do that to another husband? "Jim, my husband died 2 years ago. Cancer," she quietly whispered. Jim sat still, absorbing this new information. True, while he had told her about Monique and Sofie, she hadn't spoken about her husband. He watched as a single tear formed in Mila's eye, and then ran down her cheek. He reached out and caught it with his finger. She clasped his hand and pressed it to her cheek. "But you hardly know me." "How can you?" Jim stopped. "What did you say?" How what?" "I love you," Mila whispered, as she moved onto the bed. 2 years later, Annalise had kissed her daddy goodnight as Mila and Jim prepared to go to dinner and a play in Baltimore, with business associates of Mila's. Unlike John Borden, Jim recognized that he couldn't fund any lifestyle at the level that Mila and his daughter, as he thought Annalise to be, deserved. He adjusted to the luxury, but limited what his wife and father-in-law could give him. He was seduced by those wonderful patent shoes. He didn't know how he'd ever walked in any other shoes, and because of the dinners and meetings to which he accompanied his wife, allowed her to purchase his wardrobe. Now the shoes were joined by Seville Row suits, custom shirts from Hong Kong, silk ties from Japan, and casual clothing that cost more than the total of all the items Jim could remember buying in his life. But he figured some compromise and sacrifices were required in a marriage, so he would just have to grin and bear it. While his wife wielded power in the corporate world and her family was worth more than some nation's GNP, Jim happily worked as an engineer for a factory outside Wilmington, earning $77,000 per year. He used his salary to take his wife and Annalise on vacations and day trips, although the corporate jet was used. He was gainfully employed, working at a job he enjoyed and understood, had a wife and daughter he loved, and was blissfully happy. Mark and Felice thought he was nuts. He had deeded their house to them as a belated wedding gift and sent presents to their daughters. But he couldn't compete with their adopted grandfather. Lars had them over to Europe several times a year, with Annalise. The 3 girls were like sisters, and Lars enjoyed spoiling them all. Mark especially thought Jim was crazy. He had no problem wearing his Patek Philippe watch, and Felice loved her necklace, although when she found out what it had cost, she rarely wore it. It spent its time in a safety deposit box. As Jim and Mila exited Marduk's restaurant in Baltimore, Mila felt Jim suddenly pull her back. When she looked to see what the matter was, she saw him staring at 2 women coming up the sidewalk. When they saw Jim, they too pulled up abruptly. The younger of the 2 women breathlessly gasped, "Jim." Mila could feel her husband make an effort to relax. "Monique," Jim stated flatly, without expression. Mila started, recognizing Jim's ex-wife's name. She looked intently at the woman, taking in the tattooed neck and ankles. This was not what she had expected, from Jim's description. Monique was wearing a shapeless dress with long sleeves and a bodice buttoned up to the neck. She looked worn and miserable, probably more so at encountering her ex-husband, but the lines of grief were not new to her face. "Nice tattoo." Mila was surprised at the pettiness Jim was showing. "I hope you found the joy you sought being dominated." Mila realized that her Jim wasn't being petty. He was in shock. Monique's face fell, and she turned, sobbing, and began running back the way she had come. Sofie watched her daughter and then turned to Jim. "That was not necessary, you pathetic man." Mila, knowing the history of this woman, burst out. "No, not pathetic. I'm pathetic. Sympathetic. Jim is a good man. It is you and your daughter who are pathetic." She drew herself up and pulled Jim to her. "Not my husband. And he dominates me. He dominates me with gentleness, with love, with caring. Go away, you evil, nasty woman." As Mila pulled her stunned husband into their limousine, Sofie could only stare in amazement, before finally turning to find intent to her daughter. As they pulled away from the curb, Mila snuggled against her husband, gathering him into her arms. "What do you say, we skip the play? I can offer the Brownmillers my apologies tomorrow." Jim rested his head against his wife's and let out a suppressed sob as he gasped for breath. "I loved her. How could she do that to herself? Why, Mila?" Her strong husband was racked with sobs. Mila hugged him tightly, worried deeply for her husband. Should I have left? Did I do this to her? Could I have saved her if I had stayed? Mila pushed her husband away from her, so she could look into his eyes. "No. How can you think that? You didn't do this. She and her mother are the only ones responsible. Had you stayed, it would have ruined you as well. You did the only thing you could do." She could see in his eyes that he still felt guilty. He was happy, but Monique was destroyed. It didn't give him pleasure. It hurt him to see someone he had loved suffering. Mila's heart swelled with love for this man. What if we got her help? Maybe a psychiatrist. Maybe someone who could remove those ghastly tattoos. Whatever she needs, we will help her, okay? What do you think? She pulled Jim back into her arms, resting her head on his chest, hearing his breathing and the beat of his heart. Would that be something you'd want to do? Yes, please. Jim sighed. Can we go home now? I want to hold you and analyze. I need to remember how good life is. Mila decided to hold the surprise she planned for Jim for another night. She couldn't wait too long, or it would be obvious that Analyze was going to have a sibling. In the end, Monique got her wish. Jim did come to save her, although they never saw each other again. Mila had arranged for third parties to handle everything, and between counseling and removal of her tattoos and piercings, as well as some plastic surgeries to repair scar damage on her torso and buttocks, Monique began to achieve, if not happiness, equilibrium in her life. She never married, never again dated. She returned to work and found a job in DC as a translator, mainly dealing with legal documents. It was very much like her job had been at the Saigon embassy all those years ago. Outside of work, she volunteered at an abused women's charity. No one seemed surprised that she didn't date or socialize with anyone at work. They all felt that a single woman of her age, between 45 and 50, had settled into a spinster lifestyle long before. No one would have believed her to be barely in her 30s. And that's it for today's story, friends. If you enjoyed today's story, leave a like and comment before you leave. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss any video. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next video.